Friends, I have to level with you. Many more families are going to lose loved ones before their time. Those are the words of Boris Johnson a few weeks ago. It's hard to remember when a Prime Minister has had to make a statement like that in peacetime. Thinking and talking about death is not something any of us like to do particularly. And yet perhaps one of the reasons this virus is causing fear and anxiety is because it is exposing our frailty as human beings, that there are things that are totally out of our control. We've been shown the curves that tell us the predicted number of infections and deaths, and we know the aim is to flatten those curves, but we also know, if we stop to think about it, that while flattening those curves may in the short term enable our heroic NHS to cope, it is still just delaying the inevitable. As an epidemiologist wrote in one of the many articles that have been written on this virus, almost as an aside, he said, it's helpful to remember that everyone has to die. It's just a question of when. That is the ultimate statistic. 1 in 1 dies. And perhaps the problem at the moment is that all the things that we usually use to flatten the curve, or at least to convince ourselves that the curve is flatter than it is, all those things are gone. We can't go out, we can't see friends, we can't live how we want to live normally. A few days ago there was a column in one of the national papers written by a therapist talking about her advice for dealing with grief and anxiety during this coronavirus crisis. She said there's a general sense that there's no one in charge that we know is going to sort the coronavirus problem. There's no saviour. And if that is your starting point, talking and thinking about death is fairly bewildering and not especially attractive. But what if there is more we can say? What if there is a God who has not lost control, who has an answer to death itself? In Luke's Gospel in the Bible, Luke sets out his account of Jesus' life. Luke's a historian who has compiled eyewitness testimony, and he records a time when Jesus encountered a group of mourners going to a funeral. And it's a remarkable story because in just a few short verses, it records two things about Jesus' response to the grief and anguish and horror and terror of death. It records his compassion and his power. So here is what happens. Jesus went, this is Luke chapter 7, beginning at verse 11. Jesus went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went along with him. As he approached the town gate, a dead person was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a large crowd from the town was with her. When the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her, and he said, "Don't cry." Then he went up and touched the coffin, and those carrying it stood still. He said, "Young man, I say to you, get up." The dead man sat up and began to talk, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. They were all filled with awe and praised God. "A great prophet has come among us," they said. "God has come to help his people." This news about Jesus spread throughout Judea and the surrounding country. So Jesus is going towards the town of Nain in Israel, and coming the other way out of the town, he meets this weeping crowd. Here is this woman surrounded by her friends, and she's burying her son, and it's a tragic scene, and no parent ever wants to have to bury their own child. But if it's possible, her grief is even deeper, because not only is she burying her son, but with him she buries her hope. She's a widow, there's no one else to provide for her, there's no welfare state, there's no means of work. Now she will be reliant entirely on the handouts from others. Often when Jesus meets people, the gospel writers emphasize the faith of the people that he meets. They come to him. They know their need. They recognize Jesus is someone extraordinary, and they get on their knees and they cry to him for help, for mercy. But there's none of that here. There's just a woman getting on with her day, and Jesus goes to her unbidden, unexpected. And we see first his compassion. His compassion. We read that his heart went out to her. That phrase is a phrase full of emotion. Luke only uses it in 2 other places. One time it's the story that Jesus tells of the Samaritan who famously takes pity on the Jewish man by the wayside, in contrast to the priests and the religious leaders who cross over to the other side. But his heart, the Samaritan's heart, goes out to this man and he goes to help him. The other time is in the story of the 2 lost sons. The son is left home and squandered his inheritance and ends up feeding the pigs. And he comes to his senses and he comes home and he thinks he's going to have to buy his father's affection back by becoming his slave. And his father sees him coming and his heart goes out to him. And he runs to embrace his lost son and to welcome him home. Well, here it is Jesus himself. His heart, it goes out to this woman uniquely in Luke's gospel. And here Jesus is making the first move, and he's going to her in her grief as she faces humanity's greatest enemy. Sometimes we ask, how could a loving God allow the world to be like this? How could he allow death with all its ugly, painful separation? How could he allow pandemics or war or suffering on the epic scales we know humanity is capable of? Well, the beginning of God's answer to that is that he hasn't stayed aloof, far off, distant, immune from the predicament of his creatures. He's come and got involved in the mess. He's lived the life of an outcast, often misunderstood, hated, rejected, and ultimately murdered unjustly. And he wept in the face of death. We know that explicitly when he went to the grave of Lazarus, his friend, before he raised him from the dead. But it would be no surprise if there were tears here too, as his heart is full of compassion for this woman. When we feel the hopelessness that we feel in the face of death, or the frailty and the insecurity of life, maybe we also feel that God feels distant, uncaring, or that he's abandoned us. Well, in Jesus we see the opposite is true. On the cross on the first Good Friday, Jesus cried out, my God, why have you abandoned me?" See, in our hopelessness, when we feel abandoned, that is where we may be closest to his experience. And therefore, in our hopelessness, that may well be where he is closest to us. He knows what it is to suffer. But if we're honest, we don't just need compassion. We don't just need someone who comes down here and gets in the muck alongside us. We need someone who can actually do something about the problem that we face. And that is why we need to see Jesus' power alongside his compassion, his power. So secondly, what Jesus does next would be appallingly inappropriate were it not for the outcome. He interrupts this funeral procession. He approaches the coffin. What's he doing? Who's this guy? Why is he coming? He touches the coffin. You can't do that. That makes you unclean. Any loyal Israelite would know that. And then he says, "Young man, I say to you, get up." Now that's a completely ridiculous thing for any normal person to say to someone who's died. But don't miss what he's claiming by that statement. This isn't a prayer to God to do a miracle. This is a command by his own authority. I say to you, get up. See, this is a claim and then a proof, not just to be doing God's work on earth, but to be God himself on earth. I tell you, I am the giver of life. I tell you, get up. This is God on earth as a man. He stepped into the world to deal with the mess caused by sickness and suffering and sin and death. But we need to make sure we don't miss what this is pointing to, because it's easy to think, well, I would love to have my loved one back. Why can't he do this for me? Why doesn't he come and rescue all those who face death daily, and especially at a time like this? And the thing is, there were plenty of people who died in Galilee or in Israel while Jesus was on earth. There were plenty of people that he didn't go to help. He didn't make it his life's work to go to every funeral and every sickbed to make things better. And actually, when you think about it, even for this guy who is given a second chance, this dead young man, well, he's raised to life and he goes off and he lives his life. At some point, he will have died again. And the thing is, these miracles that Jesus did are not ends in themselves. They're meant to act as signposts. They're not the main event. They're like snowdrops. The first sign at the end of winter that spring is coming. The snowdrops. We've seen them already this year. They're not spring itself, and they're certainly not summer. Summer hasn't arrived when snowdrops come, but you know when you see the snowdrops at the end of winter, you know spring and summer are coming. And that is what Jesus' miracles are like. They are a taster, they're a pointer to what is to come, which is the new heavens and the new earth. When God's kingdom in all its fullness comes to earth, and there will be no more mourning or crying or sickness or pandemics or pain or death. And this little account is here to show us that Jesus came to bring hope for the hopeless in the face of death and in the face of everything that stands between us and God. They were all filled with awe and praised God, Luke says. God has come to help his people, they said. God has come as Jesus to live a life of compassion and power, and then to die in order to break through everything that is opposed to God and break through death as he rose 3 days later in victory over evil. This world is broken. We are broken. We've turned our backs on the God who made us. It's not meant to be this way. When the Prime Minister is levelling with us and warning us of what is to come, we need to sit up and listen. And Luke in his Gospel is imploring us to do the same. Death doesn't have to be the great unmentionable. There is a Saviour. There is a safe way through death to the other side if we will come to Jesus and trust him. St John's Downshire Hill in Hampstead, like every other church in London and the UK, has stopped meeting in its own building, but we're still here online. And after Easter, we will be aiming to run on Zoom an online version of the course Christianity Explored, which so many people have found helpful to look into these things further. If you've not done that before and you'd like to join us, you'd be really welcome wherever you live, whether local or afar. Do subscribe to our YouTube channel and our Facebook page to hear more. And if you're not already part of a church, do join us on Sundays on our live stream via our website, www.sjdh.org, where we seek to introduce one another to Jesus, who meets us in our helplessness and hopelessness with compassion and with power.